organizing team, I wish to extend a warm welcome to Professor Yaacob, Chairman of the SJI Governing Board. His Excellency Mr. Nikesh Mehta, the Deputy Commissioner to Singapore, and with distinguished guests, great ladies and gentlemen, to the Marine Monitoring for Action meeting. The Marine Monitoring for Action is organized by the St. John's Island National Marine Laboratory and the Marine Environment Sensing Network Project, with the support of the British High Commission and the Flying Artists Collective. The National Marine Lab on St. John's Island is Singapore's only offshore marine research center. It is the National Research Foundation and research now hosted by US and open to all researchers, bringing together marine scientists, resource managers, and policy makers from Singapore and Southeast Asia, as well as the UK. This workshop aims to explore how we can better safeguard our shared seas through effective marine monitoring. We are excited to share with you a line of talks and activities over the next few days. We're going to dive deeper into the world of marine monitoring. I'd like to invite Professor Yaacob, Chairman of the Johns Island National Marine Laboratory's Governing Board, to deliver the opening address for this forum. Professor Yaacob, please.
Good morning to all of you. It's Excellency, Mr. Nikesh Mehta, esteemed colleagues, distinguished visitors with the building. I really begin by welcoming all our foreign next facility. I hope you will see me will be both hopeful and meaningful. And do take some time to enjoy some of the sights in our small island. After the word fortune, simple really can be unpredictable. You could have sunshine in the morning, followed by typical thunderstorm in the afternoon and a cloudy night. So do bring an umbrella when you go about. For those who are unfamiliar with the property, do use some sunscreen as ultraviolet can be really harmful. Yeah, for people who are wearing at times, so please endure your sleeping as well. And it's again a privilege for me this morning to open the marine monitoring for afternoon. As we gather in Singapore and island city state with winds as much as sea, about approximately 650 kilometers, 2 kilometers. As we do land, approximately 720 square kilometers. So, reminded, we need to have to set the one is a real life, before the right health. Our workers not just source of beauty and wonder, they are vital to survival. Already, our climate support biodiversity and provide livelihoods for millions of people. There are huge archipelagic islands in Southeast Asia whose population depends on the sea. Yet our oceans are really facing unprecedented challenges. From climate change and pollution to overfishing and habitat loss. Moreover, the sea is a major connector of the sea. Singapore to one of the most Southeast sits in the maritime continent and makes up a place like a land seascape and extraordinary biodiversity. The confluence of major seas and coastal regions of the Indian Ocean. This especially requires geopolitical balance, which unwanted fish movers, many invasive species, benefits, nutrients, and pollutants, all makes it form of this interconnected marine realm. So we share good with good and not so good. Marine issues cannot therefore be managed by one country. To safeguard our shared seas, close collaboration, general knowledge, expertise, and data are essential. This week, we have the opportunity to come together as a community of experts, practitioners, and advocates to do just that, to rise up to the challenges of making a collective impact for oceans. Let's also understand the demand of the Vision 2030. In recognizing this, the Marine Monitoring Commission has also been endorsed by the UNESCO International Marine Monitoring Commission as a UN Ocean Decade activity. The work that we do to monitor our shared marine environments of culture. It enables us to understand the local populations, develop science-based policy, informs management decisions, and empowers local community to protect their marine resources. Today and tomorrow, the workshop will focus on how marine markets for science and policy and status of marine market in Singapore and the region. The rest of the week will be Singapore's marine messages island, including SGL and the platform of the workshop. Exploring human skills and contributing to the rigorous and scientifically sound marine living. So I'm excited for you to visit this facility in Asia. This is Swiss and really also marine for 60 feet. This is a shape national research infrastructure in 2016. Beyond this activity, the Asian to continue working closely together with other Angola, building links with marine research stations across the region and globally. So I think that over 20, we are scientists and engineers where bodies will follow away. One region where scientists and practitioners are leading and moving powers and things and requirements. Start making it plans to probably to coordinate directive with delicious accuracy in our region agencies, research scientific and participating in the research and oceanography and environment, yet insulation to the environment in the state industries and the engaged. Look at here, the same base for the field and retail, to the sustainable income, the president sees the affinity for the player, the advancing to the field, the link, the simple, the range, the times, and the physical science. Indeed, your presence was simply agency of Singapore is known for using this with various systems of pioneers in this development and Singapore, the Nanyang Technological University, the Singapore Institute of Technology, and Singapore Institute of Technology and Design, and also from the various public agencies that we have here in Singapore, such as the PUB, who is a water authority, the National Environment Agency, NEA, the Maritime Port Authority, MPA, Singapore Port Agency, SFA, and parks, like the parks and the all our parks. The internet is here to language on this weekend to forge new partnerships, thereby facilitating entrepreneurial impact, and of course, for innovative solutions that can enhance our monitoring capabilities. Together, we can build a comprehensive understanding of the marine environment and develop effective strategies to protect it. So as we move forward, let us remember that the health of the ocean is a shared and collective responsibility. It is our duty to ensure that we a vibrant and resilient marine ecosystem. So I hope that by the end of this week, we can advance further towards strengthening a regional network of marine researchers to promote and synergize marine environmental sciences as part of ASEAN. So thank you once again for coming together for this inaugural workshop. I look forward to the impactful discussions and collaborations that will arise from our time together here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yaacob, for the inspiring speech and call to action. Please join me to welcome His Excellency Mr. Nikesh Mehta, the British High Commissioner to Singapore, for his opening address. Your Excellency, please.
Him and Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this inaugural lecture. My name is Nick Mehta, and I'm the British High Commissioner to Singapore, and it's a pleasure to be with you here this morning. I want to start by thanking Professor Yaacob for your warm words. And I also want to say thank you to Dr. Charlie Townsend and your team for organising this lecture. Some of you may be aware that last Thursday I spent a fantastic morning with Dr. Yanni and her team at the St. John's Island National Marine Laboratory. This is the IMML. So you're going to do one thing, Dr. Yanni, can you please come up with an easy to use? It takes about 15 minutes to see the little thing. Um, but it was incredible to go behind the scenes of this marine research facility and to see the amazing work that you and your team are doing to enhance marine research and the public. And I think that my fifth opinion on living is doing nicely. Everyone telling me that, also don't say that the living is the revolution. And I think absolutely clearly they separate at some point. It was a real honor to visit. And As I was there, I also got a chance to see just how far advanced the collaboration between the UK and Singapore goes. As you go into this facility to the left-hand side, you'll see an icon of Providence that date from the 1950s. And those are so relevant. I didn't know this before. It was the original Singapore from 1955 1957. So in some ways, my long-time predecessor. But that future just that future from visiting St. Valley, just issues, just one thing that collaboration goes. Yeah, I think we're going to be showing you around. So before we think about today's event, I do want to go back in history a little bit, not quite as far back as 1955, but to 2020, when together with Singapore, the UK launched the successful £6 million collaboration between our National Environment Research Council and the Marine Science Research and Development Programme to support our research communities to tackle the wider regional marine plastic pollution. This fund supported four programs which enable researchers in the UK and Singapore to collaborate with Southeast Asian regional researchers focus on the impacts of plastic pollution. And as part of the UK and Singapore strategic partnership, we are committed to strengthening even further our science and technology partnership, so going further than we did in 2020, and developing capabilities to address global issues and challenges. I don't need to tell all of you in this room that there is no bigger challenge than our climate. I hope that you've all had a chance to read the speech that the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy gave in Kew Gardens a couple of weeks ago. And if you haven't, please do look it up. He said, our goal is progressive, a livable planet for all, now and in the future. And he is committed that action on climate and nature policies will be central to all that the Foreign Office does, with an emphasis on not just halting, but reversing the decline in global biodiversity. And as I begin my 4-year term here in Singapore, I can assure you that there is no bigger mission that we have in our High Commission than working with partners from Southeast Asia on tackling the scourge of climate change. Today, we're delighted to be supporting the inaugural marine monitoring connection network, which has now been banned as a UN ocean control activity, a clear indication of the importance of this work. And I'm really, really just delighted that we have UK participants in this workshop. So I think they will mind me calling them out. And I'll just ask them to stick up their hands as I pull out their names. From the BHC, Professor Steve Widdicombe. I think it's funny, before that somebody else, Professor Mike Frost, where Professor Mike Frost, and Professor Helen Finlay, and Cephas. So Cephas is easy to say. From something so proud of them. Eventually, we had major participation in the question. It's called pressing changes that affect our globally. So, and I think it's particularly impressive that the 50 odd people that we have participating, even a third were overseas. Let me just say one final word about the UK's commitment to this agenda, and then I'll hand over to the next speaker. The UK has developed strong scientific capability for protecting and monitoring the marine environment, involving key UK government bodies. These bodies play an important role, for example, in the monitoring and predicting of ocean marine heat waves and their effect on ocean health and biodiversity. I was just before coming into the speech, I was speaking to a colleague from Ghana who was telling me about the devastating impact that global temperature rises have had on coral bleaching in his part of Malaysia. Just a real concrete example of some of the issues that we're all dealing with. But the most significant thing that we can do in this workshop is work out ways that we can coordinate together and we can share the data that we can their planet and how we can share and voice amongst ourselves. This is not just a problem for the UK or for Malaysia or for Singapore. It's a problem that we all have to face together. And that I hope that this function provides an opportunity for open discussion on how we can tackle these issues collectively and how we can share expertise and learnings. So I look forward to hearing how this lecture goes. I wish you all the very, very best for the next few days. And my thanks again to Dr. Johnny and her team for organising this. And I hope it's a fantastic few days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for the invigorating speech. We finally invite you to remain in the first round. Apologies, as we went to disagree with little token of our appreciation for gracing us with your presence today. Professor Yaacob, may I invite you back to present His Excellency our token of appreciation. And please do listen to this for a nice meeting another time.
Can you give this to me just for saying St. John's Island? In one breath. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. You may now return to your seat. Now it's for this. Thank you. We now want to invite Dr. Yani Tanzil, Facility Director of the St. John's Island National Marine Laboratory, to present Professor Yaacob with our token of appreciation for all your support always. Thank you, Dr. Yani. Dr. Lee, for you, for your class.
Oh my God.
We are the different child. Exactly. So sorry, kindly you remain in the front. Excellency, Mr. Nikesh Mehta, Professor Steve Widdicombe, Professor Mary Press, and Professor Paul Yankin onto the front for a group photo.
Scan the batches. We fix the used to be in the
Okay, one, two, that's right. Thank you so much, once again. We kindly invite everyone to return to their seats as we would now like to take a group workshop photo with everyone here. Please. Okay. Here to the camera and make sure you can see the camera. Does everybody want to do a fun shot? Ready? One, two, three.
idea that
It is.
what is the first thing right there?
It's fine here. Here, thank you, everyone. And please join me in thanking His Excellency Mr. Nikesh Mehta and Professor Yaacob Ibrahim once again as they also take their leave. And leaving us today, guys. Don't worry, there's tomorrow to check in on us.
I'm coming out the wrong door.
commence with today's program with two wonderful talks by our invited experts from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, Professor Steve Widdicombe and Professor Matt Frost, on how long-term marine observations can be used to shape policy and management. And first, we have Professor Matt Frost for his talk on marine monitoring for action, how data can be used to shape policy and management. Professor Frost is a senior leader with over 20 years' experience in the charity and research sector. He is the head of the International Office of Plymouth Marine Laboratory, with a focus on science and diplomacy. Before I hand over the floor to Professor Frost, a quick announcement to attendees joining on site and online. Slide link will be shown on the screen if you have any questions you may have for our speakers. In-person participants may also use the microphones on the floor at the end of the back-to-back talks. Without any further ado, Dr. Frost, please.
Some microphone for you. And can I trouble you to click this onto your shirt as well?
Yep.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
what about moving this? Is there a something big how it all works?
Yeah.
That one there, yeah, yeah. So that point there, that
Point yeah.
pointer. Ah, perfect. Right, excellent. Thank you. Right. So, firstly, thank you, Yanni, and for organising a workshop. And it's great to see everybody here. I'm hoping that I get to speak to at least a few of you over the next few days. I'm really excited about it. And both Steve and myself are running this first session really to started in sort of fairly high level. So for many years, I used to run these workshops in Spain and other places that would go for a week or two. And we would start the first day, we would take people out to the shore, and we were catching organisms from the sand and things like that. Then we would start doing some identification, then we would start doing some analysis, then we would do the number criteria, then we would do some stuff around indicators, and by the end of it, we put all the people on the course to now write a policy brief. So it was tracing that journey from data collection all the way through to influencing policy. Now, you'll be pleased to know, as far as I'm aware, none of you have asked to write a policy brief at the end of this. Is that right, Amy? Actually, thinking about it, so there we go. Um, but what I want to do in my first talk is go the other way. So I want to start off with really, at the end of the day, all of us have these jobs where we go out and we work with data, we collect samples, we buy, we use ships and things like that. And Steve will be going into some detail on this. Why are we all doing it? What is it being used for? And that's really what I want to talk about in this presentation. So I'm going to be doing three things. First, I want to talk a little bit about policy at the highest level, so the international and global level, the ocean science policy interface. Um, and then I want to go back to the global ocean agenda, then the science policy interface, and how do we get our data into global and international policy? How do we influence that? And then thirdly, looking at a bit more at the national level. So it's a journey down from the very highest level. So where we're starting is here. So I'm going to come back to this in another talk tomorrow, but it's just a reminder that ultimately this is the blue marble, very famous photo taken by the Apollo 17 mission in 1972, which really showed our planet was an ocean planet. And all of us, no matter what we do when we work in the marine field, we contribute to our understanding, our management, our sustainable use of this one ocean. And I'm sure most of you realise in the next few years there's been a real move away from talking about oceans plural to the fact that it's one connected ocean. There are five main sub-regions of that, which won't go into now, but it is one ocean. So everything we're doing this workshop this week is contributing to our understanding and how we work with the planet. So very quickly, what I want to do here, I'm not going to go through in detail because this is one of the things I teach on is international legislation and policy, is just to remind ourselves that we're one ocean, but also there's a lot of policy and legislation in managing and working together. So if you look, so Hugo Grotius often refers to as the father of international law. In the 17th century, everybody was sailing around the ocean, exploring, and the sort of questions started to be asked about how we work together in the ocean. And we decided to write some stuff around how do we know who's allowed to sail where, and who owns which bit of the ocean? How do we all work together? And he wrote some very important early works on this international area. And that's really the beginning of this understanding that we're all in this one planet together, and how do we work together in this global ocean. And this is probably the most important sort of work that's been done, the Marine, which was all about freedom of the seas. And I'm not going to go, you'll be pleased to know, for the next 400 years of international legislation and policy, but lots happened. And then it ended up, I would say, really, in some ways, it all built up to this, probably the most important piece of global legislation that we have, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. That is the big sort of convention that governs how we all work together in the ocean. And then on the back of that, there's all sorts of bilateral and other agreements we have. And if you look at the Environmental Agreements database, there are over 3,700 international treaties today. That's huge. I mean, that's, there are a lot of these treaties on how we govern the environment at the global level. So the question is, for us as scientists, is how do we influence all of this? How do we guide this? Because all of this, without any data, without any information, without any science, doesn't work. It's as simple as that. So how do we feed into that? And that's what I want to talk about. So if you really want to look in more detail, you can go onto the database here, and it will give you a list of a lot of the multilateral environmental agreements. As I said, there's getting on for 4,000 of them. And all of this relies on data. All of this relies on scientists collecting, analyzing, communicating, and otherwise none of this will actually work. And we've seen really from in 1972 to 1992, a lot of these agreements came about. A lot of the key ones that most of us will know. 92, of course, was when we had the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UNFCCC. Some of the main international law to do with the environment came about in the 90s. And then today, really, the focus is on climate change, it's on social justice, it's on equity. Uh, but the main thing I would say today is the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because the question is, when you look at a complicated framework like that with thousands of treaties, what is the overarching framework that we're working to? And it's this: 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed at the UN conference in 2012, and the 2030 Agenda adopted by member states. And if you want an overarching framework for how we approach managing our planet, but in particular our seas as well, then the Sustainable Development Goals is really the high overarching framework. Oops, sorry. So you've got 17 of them, and the important thing is that one of these is Sustainable Development Goal 14, Life Below Water. So that's an SDG focused particularly on the ocean, and it has a lot of targets associated with it. Now, the important thing to remember is that even though SDG 14 is the target that we've all adopted for the ocean, actually, and this article here, the really nice article explains this, the ocean flows through all 17 of these sustainable development goals. You're not going to solve issues around poverty, around hunger, around climate action, around all of these things actually, without us managing and engaging with the ocean. So this is really important to remember. Even though there's Sustainable Development Goal 14, this overarching framework actually needs ocean information in all of it. And if you look at the way Sustainable Development Goal 14 is managed, this Global Ocean Science Report came out in 2020, and it actually talked about how are all the countries in the world doing with getting that science and getting that information to support Sustainable Development Goal 14. And I'm not going to go through this, but here's a list of the targets under Sustainable Development Goal 14. Here's a list of the indicators, and it's really complicated because you've got all these different UN agencies which are responsible for these different indicators and targets. So I don't know how many of these you know, but you've got things like the FAO, which is the Fisheries Organization. You've got the United Nations Environment Programme. You've got all of these different UN bodies, all responsible for getting science into this whole area so that we can deliver on these targets for the Sustainable Development Goal. Now, it became quite obvious that this is quite a complicated picture, and particularly as scientists, how do you get the science into that? It's quite a messy picture. So that was one of the reasons we had this. So just to give me an idea for the rest of this talk and tomorrow as well in terms of policy, how many of you are familiar with the Ocean Decade? Okay, so quite a few of you. So the Ocean Decade, as was announced, has actually endorsed this workshop because one of the things the Ocean Decade wants to do is essentially this, the science we need for the ocean we want. So the Ocean Decade is all about making sure the science that we do, the data we generate, the observations we make, all of it feeds into meeting these challenges for SDG 14. And it's their mission is transformative ocean science for sustainable development. So that's why the Ocean Decade was set up in 2020. And the whole focus is 10 years really to get science into policy. Now, I chair the UK's National Decade Committee, but I also work with the IOC in bringing together these nearly 40 national decade committees globally, and we bring them together to look at how we get science into policy. Now, it's not just the Ocean Decade. I'm not going to go into detail here, but just to say that there's been a real move in the last 10 years, I would say, and in the last 5 years in particular, where the ocean is massively high on the agenda now. I mean, way more than it was even a few years ago. So everything from the G7 to the UN Ocean conferences, there's been legislation recently, such as for the high seas. There's legislation on monitoring for the prevention of biological diversity. You've got things like the G7 leaders now who actually have this ocean component to what they're doing. So, in terms of ocean policy, I would say that we're really pushing an open door. There's never been such an exciting time for scientists to engage in policy. Maybe many years ago, it wasn't as high on the global agenda. And even if as a scientist you wanted your science to be used, the same opportunities didn't exist as exist today. So I would just say, make the most of it. It's really exciting that our politicians and others are all talking about the ocean. And actually, the High Commissioner just talked about the British Foreign Secretary announcing stuff to do with the environment and climate change and the ocean. So, you know, if there's nothing else you remember, let's grab the opportunity while we can because we've got a really open door at the moment with our politicians to go out there and actually push this global ocean agenda. And finally, for this section on how sort of international policy works in terms of marine and the ocean, it's really important to say that if all we have is these sustainable development goals, then basically all we have is words. It's kind of just ambition. It's kind of nice. It sounds great, we're going to do this and do that, but actually there's no meat to the bones. There's nothing happening. It only works because for each of these sustainable development goals, you have a list of international conventions and treaties. So it's that international law which actually implements this. So if you take Sustainable Development Goal 14, you can see there's a whole raft of international agreements here. UNCLOS, there's the fish stocks agreements, there's the Ramsar Convention. I won't go through all of them, but for each of these sustainable development goals, you have all of this international law. So that's really important because without these international agreements, as I mentioned earlier, then this is just higher level ambition. So this is the big question. That was a very brief, I would usually spend at least 1 or 2 lectures or an entire module going through that, but you've had it in about 6 slides. Very brief introduction to global policy. The question then becomes is,
I don't know where it went there. The question then becomes, how do we make this journey? So this is what we're going to be talking about a lot this week, observations, and Steve's going to be giving some really nice, well, a really nice story around this and how we collect stuff and how it starts to make this journey from observations through to data management. So the data we collect, how do we manage that? How do we then synthesize and use that data to produce information at the regional and global level that then feeds into the sort of stuff I'm talking about, which is these reporting at the UN level and enables us to make decisions. So it's this journey really, which I'm talking about in this lecture, but also I want you to bear this in mind all week that we're working largely at this level and perhaps a bit at this level, but actually that's the journey we're on. It's heading up this way to inform global policy. So I just want to give some examples. So some of you may stay as scientists, data people, whatever, but some of you may think, okay, you're telling me about all this. How do we engage? What do we actually do to get our science into the process? So, oh, sorry, I've got to press the right button here. There we go. Um, so one of the key things is that all of these conventions are well aware that without monitoring, without observations, without data, without science, they can't do anything. They can't achieve anything. At the very heart of it is getting all our marine observations and data and science in. So all of them have these science bodies. Um, so these two are for two of the two main conventions, CBD and UNFCCC, and they've set up these subsidiary science bodies so that actually the science can feed in. So that's just an important thing to note, that when you hear about these international environmental treaties, actually the key part is these bodies that feed the science into them. So that's what we want to engage with. I'm not going to go into detail on this, well, masses of detail. I did this for our own organisations, Plymouth Marine Laboratory, but this just gives some examples here to show that you've got so this is for the UNFCCC. So you've got the main climate, you're all aware of the COP meetings and things like that. But around this, you've got the science bodies I've just talked about. There's all these opportunities for science to feed in. So, for example, it might be that you attend, so Plymouth Marine Laboratory, we attend these meetings and we feed into panels and other things where we can give advice and give key messages. It might be that you're involved in some of the reports. So some of you have heard of things like the IPCC reports and others that feed into it. And then there's NGOs who are also doing scientific reporting. So there's all these opportunities around international law to get involved. So we're also involved in these ocean and climate change dialogues where we go along and we feed in information. This is just one treaty, and just to give you an idea of all the opportunities that come to feed in. So this is how science feeds in there at the international level. And this is all, these are lots of examples of marine reports. And as I said, marine sort of NGO policy briefings and other ways of informing that level of science. Of policy rather. The other thing I want to mention quickly is the regular process. So once again, this is really asking the question, how do we know what state our ocean is in so that we can manage it better at this global level? So the regular process produces these world ocean assessments, and there's been two so far, and the third one is in press. I won't go through the evolution of the regular process, but you can see it's been sort of 20 years in the making. And what this does is this is a way of allowing policymakers at the highest level to get sort of a snapshot. What is the state of our ocean? What is the state of different components of the ecosystem? And once again, this is another area where science can feed in. And finally, on the international side, I just want to point out that one of the key things that we develop from marine observations and data and sampling is basically indicators. So what normally happens is we collect data. So this is the focus of this workshop here, collection and monitoring. And from that, we develop indicators. And an indicator, quite simply, is something that indicates something. It tells us something about the state of a component, of an ecosystem. And then that can feed into management and advice. Based on that, we can set strategies and targets, and then back to collecting more data. So that's the kind of circle in terms of the way indicators work. And here's an example so these are for global policy. This is global level indicators. So if you look at the ocean monitoring indicators, which are the ones that the Copernicus oversee, they have indicators to tell us about ocean circulation and climate and health and ocean extremes. They use these indicators to show how things are changing. They then produce these state of the ocean reports, and there was one published very recently here. So if you want to see what's happening in it with mean sea level or sea surface temperature or ocean acidification or lots of these other areas, then the data that we collect feeds into these indicators and then produces these reports that can be used at the global level. Another example is that the World Meteorological Office, and basically what the WM does is has these 7 key indicators here under these 4 different headings. And what they do then is, and this is bringing it back to how I started, is they're using these indicators, they track what's going on in these areas, and then they link it to the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can actually look at Sustainable Development Goal 14 and say, well, what's happening in terms of CO2 concentration or ocean acidification or sea ice extent? So this is one of the main ways that our science feeds into policy, is through them being used to track status through the development of these indicators, and then it feeds back into these SDGs. So that's the international side. But what I want to focus on now is the national level, because the international is interesting. It's a it's a complicated framework, but when you get to the national level, boy, is it complicated. This is a horrible diagram. I mean, this is really horrible. In fact, the name of the paper is called The Ultimate Horrendogram. Um, because it is, it's horrendous. And what this is showing essentially is when you get to the national level, you then have all these layers, because the only way so I said that the only way the Sustainable Development Goals work is through international legislation, but the only way international legislation works is through national implementation. So if your national governments don't do anything, then actually the international law doesn't mean anything at all. It has to be implemented and brought into the national process. And what this diagram attempts to do is show that the journey from essentially the international law outwards right through to national law. And this is just drawing all the lines through the different agencies that manage all the different bits of legislation and policy, to show how international policy eventually is delivered at the national level. It's really there not so you can learn from it, but so you can go, oh my gosh, that's complicated. That's the kind of, if that's what you think, that's the correct response to this diagram. But the point is that most of us are working in our countries, and we're working with government agencies, we're working with people on the ground to feed our science into policy in this way. So it's really important that we understand a bit of how this works at the national level. And I just want to give a couple examples of that. So here's one example of how it works in the UK. Now, apologies for using some UK examples now. I would have loved to have done lots of examples from different countries of how marine monitoring data gets into policy, but I thought it'd be better to talk about something that I actually knew about. And also, I chair this group. So this is the government's Marine Advisory Group on Climate Change. We set this up in 2005, so we've been going for nearly 20 years. And what it does is it takes evidence. So it takes evidence from observations and data collected around the UK, and it feeds it to the policy community and to other stakeholders. The idea is that it allows our government to manage the environment in the light of climate change, with the latest evidence included. So there are a couple things that we do in terms of making sure evidence is used correctly. And once again, this is a whole area that I don't have time to talk about today, but it's a really fascinating area because there are people who totally trust scientists and science. They get it, they get science, and they know that science is at the basis of everything. And in the UK, for example, the government is committed to science-based policy. Most of us say it's more science-informed rather than science-based, but science-based policy making. And many countries are saying, well, actually, we want to use science, develop the policy we work on, but there are always people who don't trust it. Even a few years ago, there were a lot of people who didn't believe the science around climate change. Even though we were collecting the data and using it, a lot of people were skeptical of it. So what we developed, and this has been taken up by a few other people in government in the UK, is we developed a mechanism whereby when you take your data and information and translate it to policy, you work out what the risks are. So this is to make sure that when people get our data, they know that we're dealing with integrity, we know that it's independent, they know that we're working as scientists, we don't have our own policy angle, we're not in it to make money, we're not in it for any, we're just giving science. So we've developed this whole process that allows the science to get into policy in this way. I won't go through all of it, but I'll just give one example. So one of them is, what experts do you talk to? So the risk here is that you have what's called expert bias. So you select the group of experts that tell you what you want to know. So if you've got an issue with pollution, for example, you might say, well, we really want people to know about this. So I'm going to get my two friends over here who've written some nice papers. They're going to say exactly what I want them to say because that's the message I want to give to government. And that's what they hear. So what we do is we have a lot of expert groups that feed into our committee, but we make sure that it includes a wide range of scientists, a wide range of opinion, and if there are different opinions, that's great. We can work with that. But it means that we're basically trusted to provide this information in a way that's full of integrity and independence, and there's no bias there. So I won't go through all the other areas, but that's one of the things you need to think about when we feed into policy. So what do we actually do? Well, one of the main things is we have a number of areas. So the ecosystem's broken up into these components, plankton, fish, etc. for ecosystem impacts. We have societal impacts around fisheries, coastal flooding. We have physical drivers. And what we do is you can go online to our website and we update the information the whole time. So as people are going out and they're monitoring and they're collecting data, we then update the assessments, and we do this regularly now. So we do some of these assessments are being updated every 2 or 3 years, and you can actually go onto the site. And importantly, you don't just get an assessment of what's going on, say, with agriculture in the light of climate change, but it takes you right back to the monitoring programs we got that data from. It takes you back to the data sets. So you can see this whole journey from the data, the monitoring, the stuff we're doing this week, right through to these policy briefs that are used by government. And quite often we're invited to government departments to do briefings on these, and we do webinars and we do policy lunch boxes. So it's a really nice example at the national level of how you can set up a system so that your data you're collecting, your monitoring you're doing feeds quite rapidly and usefully and with independence into the policy landscape. And here's just an example. We have a webinar that we did fairly recently, about 200 people on the webinar. And as I said, including people in the civil service and other areas, where we just updated what was happening with a number of these different areas. And the data feeds into policy then at the national level. So these are national adaptation programs, they're the government's marine strategies, they're atlases of information, and the data that we're collecting from marine monitoring is feeding into all of this government policy. So it's a really nice way where you can see a line from the data we're collecting to it actually changing the way we manage our ocean. Here's another example. It's linked because this came out of our own MSIP project. But what we did here is we actually took data and monitoring from fisheries and aquaculture and benthic species and benthic habitats and lots of other areas. And we worked with Professor Anna Kiros at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, who is an expert on climate smart marine planning. And what we actually did is we took that data, so you can see here, we used it to build these data sets. We did modeling scenarios. And what we were able to produce is this map of the UK showing over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years for all of these different sectors, which areas around the UK would be problematic areas due to climate change, and which ones would be actually good areas and not as impacted as the others, which we called hope spots or bright spots. So we were able to produce this map, which was then presented to the marine planners. So actually the departments in the UK who were setting up the marine plans were able to use this data to inform their next 5, 10-year strategies for how they manage the ocean. So this is a really nice example of how data and monitoring fed into modeling data sets. It was then used to produce these scenarios, which then came up with these management examples. And then another way we use data in the UK, and once again, is to go back to this whole idea of using indicators. So this is another example. So the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. I'm sorry for acronyms. Um, you had a comment about acronyms for your name. Honestly, if you go into, some of you may work in it already, but if you go to work in marine policy, honestly, it's like learning a whole new language. Sometimes I think I might just learn Mandarin or something. It's probably easier than the policy landscape. Honestly, so apologies. I've sort of realised probably too late how many acronyms are on my slides, but GES is good environmental status. That is something we're aiming to do under the MSFD, which is the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So that's how it all works. So the UK has got this process. It's actually a European process adopted by the UK, where we've developed basically what is the status of our waters. So we wrote a report saying for all of the different parameters for the biology and everything, what does the state of our seas look like? And I was the lead author on that report, and we worked with nearly 300 authors, which was amazing. And that fed into a larger report called Charting Progress. But basically, what we do in the UK is you have these indicators which tell you what is happening. Um, those indicators are then, well, they feed into monitoring programs. So this is relevant to what we're doing today. So we set up monitoring programs to make sure we can answer the questions we need. So it might be an indicator like the large fish indicator, the LFI, and that's a simple indicator of the state of your fish populations. So then we can make sure that when we're monitoring, we're collecting the right data to develop those indicators. We then have the program of measures, which is basically what you do in response. So if you're monitoring is showing actually there's a problem, you then have a response to that problem, and then that feeds into an overall marine strategy, and this goes around in this cycle. There are lots of these frameworks. I don't know if you've heard of things like DIPSA and things like that, but they're all the same thing. You collect the data, you develop an indicator, that tells you what's happening. Based on what's happening, you can then make a response, and then you do the indicator again, and it goes around in the circle. It helps you basically manage the system based on data. And you can see here a lot of these ecosystem indicators. This is another national level. So this is at the UK. This is a quick US example. So if you go onto the NOAA website in the US, you can see that they've also set up all of these indicators. These are simple indicators around the climate and the physical and biological indicators to characterize ocean conditions around salmon. So salmon farming is huge in the US. So they've developed a similar process to this, but using their own set of indicators. So all of our data and monitoring ultimately can be used to develop these systems, which are all about how we manage the system, how we get data into it. So I'm going to summarize now. It's only a few minutes to go, and Steve's going to pick up and go into some detail on more on the monitoring side. But just to summarise, data is crucial to support global policy. So that was the first bit of what I said. I hope all of you realise that what we're doing this week and what you're doing in your jobs and your careers and all the rest of it is ultimately feeding into this. How do we manage and live with this one ocean? How do we do that? And none of this works. So next time you hear a politician stand up and make a nice highfalutin statement about we're going to save the world and save the ocean and all that, none of that works without this data feeding into it. The second point, just as a reminder, is that much of this is done at the national level. So most of the management we do, most of the indicators development, the spatial planning is done at the national level, which is how this is implemented. So, and yeah, indicators are a key part of that. And I think really that's what I want you to remember from this talk really is we're on this journey. So what I've given is quite a high level, how management works, how the policy works, how the policy framework looks. But actually, if you go out tomorrow and drop a sensor off a boat and start to measure the temperature and things like that, the journey that is going on is going back here. Because without data, without science, or without marine observations, we can't manage our national seas and we definitely can't manage our global ocean. So what we're doing this week is super important, and I hope you remember that. So thank you. I think we're doing questions later, aren't we? Is that right? And Steve's coming up now?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you pass him the microphone as well?
All right. Stick him in.
I know everyone has had a lot of questions after the very exciting. So, let's go. Next, we will next invite Professor Steve Widdicombe to talk about some Photons reference on existing long-term marine observatories on science and policy. Professor Widdicombe is a marine ecologist with over 30 years in using field observations and large experiments to address real-world issues. He is the co-chair of the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, collaborative international network of scientists working on the triggers and impacts of ocean acidification. I'm sure Professor Widdicombe has many interesting experiences and stories from his many years in the field, and we look forward to his insights. Professor Widdicombe, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move that one. Oh. Oh, it's down, is it?
Yes.
There we go. Okay, so thank you for that, Matt, for giving us the introduction into the importance of our work in terms of supporting policy. One thing I would add to what Matt said is that as generators of knowledge and information, it's a responsibility we have to make sure that data gets used. It's easy to sit back and think policymakers will know where our data are and will know how to get to our knowledge, but it doesn't work like that. So an example being Matt talked to you about the World Ocean Assessment. Now, the World Ocean Assessment process is open to all of us as scientists, and we can apply to be in what's known as the pool of experts. So every one of you here can register and be in the pool of experts and then get called upon to bring your knowledge to writing those proposals. But the onus is on us to get involved and offer ourselves forward. So what I wanted to do today was pick up on Matt's presentation and talk a little bit about where the data actually come from. And I'm going to use an example from my own laboratory in Plymouth around a marine observatory, and give you a little journey through how this observatory came into being, and also the power which we can exert through observatories such as this to generate the knowledge that's required to allow that policy and international law to actually work. So what is the Western Channel Observatory? Well, the Western Channel Observatory, based off the coast of Plymouth, serves as a vital hub of oceanographic research and biodiversity monitoring in the Western English Channel. And the power of observing is not just about cataloguing change, but it's fundamentally about understanding how systems work. There is not a lot of point knowing what has happened unless you get some insight into why that has happened. Because only through understanding why can we then ultimately aim to do something about it, to do something better. So at this observatory, we not only conduct long-term observing, but we also conduct bespoke investigations into how processes function, particularly around processes that underpin how biodiversity is created and maintained, but also how climate change and other human impacts are affecting the marine system. Through the observatory, we run a number of infrastructures in order to support that. We have a vessel, Plymouth Quest, a smaller vessel, the Explorer, but we also maintain a number of data buoys. And this little hut here is the atmospheric observatory as well. And I'll talk in a little bit more detail around the integration of these facilities. And then this is Plymouth Marine Laboratory here. But in terms of a marine observatory, it's important to understand that you deliver that through an integration of technologies and an integration of infrastructures to allow you to monitor in the marine environment. Now, the marine environment, as opposed to the terrestrial environment, brings with it all sorts of complexities in terms of access. So it's often a resource-intensive activity, but I would argue it's one of the most valuable investments of that of those resources that we could possibly have. So this observatory sits off Plymouth. Here is Plymouth Sound, the River Tamar coming in. And it's not a single point of observation. We have a number of stations at different parts of the in parts of the ecosystem. But what's really important is that this part of the ocean off Plymouth represents an area that helps us understand more generally how ecosystems in this part of the Northeast Atlantic function. It's effectively a boundary region between sort of warmer waters here and the cooler waters here. There are many biogeographical ranges changing around here, with many organisms either at the most southerly point or most northerly point of their biogeographic distribution. So it's an excellent place to monitor range shifts responding to climate change. It's seasonally stratified, which is quite important because that represents a particular marine type, which is quite common in the shallow shelf areas of the Northeast Atlantic. So effectively during the summer, the water stratifies due to it's thermally stratified, and that has large implications on the plankton cycle. If you want to learn more about the WCO in terms of its structure and its history, I will direct you to this paper here by Tim Smythe in Progress in Oceanography, which in 2015 outlined the ambitions and the objectives of the observatory were. But observatories such as the Western Channel Observatory don't come around overnight. I mean, probably most of us in this room understand the amount of effort it takes to go out and observe the marine environment. And often things can start quite simply by monitoring one or two things, and it can take a long time to build something more substantial. And for the Western Channel Observatory, that journey started 140 years ago. So back at around 1884, the Marine Biological Association, which is another marine research organization based in Plymouth, was formed. And essentially, that's when observing the oceans off Plymouth began. Here we can actually see a temperature record going back to the 1900 of temperature observations for over 140 years, documenting the long-term trend in global warming. So we can see that the value of doing things for a very long time. But we didn't, that the the observations off Plymouth didn't just stay as temperature observations. The first sort of regular time series, known as E1, and that stands for England 1, was established in 1903 by a fisheries department who were interested in how fish stocks were changing around UK waters and needed to start documenting the water temperatures. So E1 as a station was launched in 1903, not with a buoy, granted, but just with taking samples from boats. Other notable milestones: in 1931, the Continuous Plankton Recorder was again started as a program of observing marine plankton, first around Plymouth, but then more on routes right around the globe by the Marine Biological Association. And that's a program that still runs today. Then in 1998, a plankton scientist at Plymouth Marine Laboratory decided that we needed to supplement the monitoring activities at the stations of the Western Channel Observatory with plankton observations. So in 1998, there was sampling was started for zooplankton and nutrients. And then a few years later in 1992, samples were started for phytoplankton. So as you can see, we're starting to build an ever more comprehensive picture of what is going on in the waters off Plymouth. And in 2006, it was decided that there was enough integrated, coordinated observation to actually consider this to be an established observatory, marine observatory. And the name Western Channel Observatory was born. In 2008, we added a regular benthic sampling station alongside carbonate chemistry, ocean acidification observing. And some eagle-eyed amongst you might notice one of our speakers here measuring carbonate chemistry as part of that. In 2009, some autonomy was brought to the system where we deployed with the deployment of buoys at 2 of the stations. And in 2013, the Penley Point Atmospheric Observatory opened. The importance being that in coastal systems, we recognize that it's not enough just to consider the wet part of the environment. It's not enough to just look at the pelagic system. We need to ensure that the interactions of the seafloor, the water, and the atmosphere are covered, and understand the trade-offs and the interactions between those systems. So in 2024, where we are now also seeing a move towards a greater integration of new technologies. AI, machine learning, autonomous platforms are starting to become more widely used and will be part of the Western Channel Observatory. So I'll show you a little bit about how that all fits together. But first, what I wanted you to gain from this image, which I think really nicely encapsulates the complexity of the Western Channel Observatory, is actually if we are going to understand how the marine system works and how it is going to respond to human-induced pressures, including climate change, it is important that we get a picture of how this system works, how the various components of this system link together. So I would argue that as valuable as monitoring particular parts of that system are, the value of adding more and more components and more observations in a coordinated manner to become an observatory, the value will increase exponentially the more you add to the understanding of the system. And as Matt said, at the end of it, the data is the currency by which we express that value. The data that we produce when we're observing the system is what is going to change people's behaviors and actions when it comes down to setting national and international policy, law, and effectively people's behaviors. So a lot of effort needs to be going into looking after the data that you produce from monitoring. in terms of not in terms of the quality of that data, the trustworthiness of it, but also the accessibility and the security of those data. Data are no good to anyone if they are on a pen drive stuck on somebody's shelf. Sharing of data is the only way in which we can change things and make things better. So there was a paper published recently, and this QR code will take you to it, which documents all of the data that are available from the Western Channel Observatory. And what is it? And we spend an awful lot of time making sure that the data collected is well integrated together. So, for example, making sure that the timestamps of various data collection pieces of data actually match up. So you can take the carbonate chemistry data with the plankton data with some of the atmospheric data and start to interpret what's going on. So money spent looking after the data is money exceptionally well spent. But how some of the data that we've produced at the Western Channel is actually being used? I want to give you some examples of how we can bring data together, the value of bringing data together from different parts of the ecosystem to actually generate understanding, to discover things we didn't previously know that can be useful to guiding how we behave in the marine environment. The first area we're going to have a look at is climate change. I mean, it's been spoken about a lot today. The fact is, it is perhaps the apex predator of anthropogenic problems at the moment. So it's the one that's probably on the most of our mind. So how can an observatory like the Western Channel Observatory contribute greater knowledge in this space? For the past 20 years, we've been collecting climate relevant observations at a couple of the stations in the channel. And what you can see, well, there's two things I want you to take away from it. The first one is the variability in the observations. So you can see we take observations very regularly, high frequency, and high frequency is key because whilst we might be thinking about trying to understand climate change, which effectively feels like a decadal scale problem, it's also important that we understand the climate or the ocean weather, because particularly in coastal areas, being able to differentiate a climate signal from a weather signal is difficult without high frequency observations, without first constraining that weather signal. So we can see here at the observatory, there's a very strong annual seasonal cycle in temperature. There are strong seasonal variabilities in some of the carbonate chemistry parameters and also in oxygen, which is largely linked to the biological processes that are going on, the normal plankton seasonal cycles. Then, on top of that, by collecting at high frequency but for a long period of time, we can now start to see these trends appearing. So after 20 years of data, we can see strong trends in warming. Of course, we have much more temperature data than this, but I've constrained that just to keep in line with the rest of these parameters. A strong warming signal, reductions in the total alkalinity of the seawater, reducing pH, so ocean acidification can be seen happening, reductions in the aragonite saturation state, and also deoxygenation. So these indicators of climate stress, warming, ocean acidification, and deoxygenation, we are observing happening off our shores in Plymouth. But perhaps more worrying than the trends are that we are starting to see the occurrence of extreme events. We talk a lot about the pressures of climate change, but actually the thing that I think is most concerning are the occurrences and the increasing occurrences of extreme climate events happening in our marine systems. And I think the importance of an observatory is to be able to detect and quantify the regularity and severity of these events, because when it comes to impacts on marine ecosystems, these extreme events are going to have quite drastic, acute effects. And in 2023, for the first time, we observed in the Northeast Atlantic shelf system a marine heat wave. You often think about heat waves being occurring in sort of more tropical waters, but we saw an extended marine heat wave happening off Plymouth, and the observatory was there to document the scale and longevity of this event. And interestingly, the marine heat wave that occurred not only had impacts on the temperature of the seawater, but there was a direct feedback to extending the heat wave that was happening on land. And in partnership with a number of colleagues, particularly at the UK Meteorological Office, we were able to document the role of the marine heat wave in exacerbating and extending the terrestrial heat wave. So if you think that what happens off our coast has no implications to our lives on land, this is evidence that that is completely wrong. So the importance of us monitoring what happens off our coast isn't just about protecting marine ecosystems. It has implications for how we consider our own adaptation and mitigation as a terrestrial species. And in 2024, these are the data here from 2024, we can see that whilst we haven't had to the same extent another severe marine heat wave, 2024 is yet another warm event, is another warm year. So we are getting warm year after warm year. So we are going to need to think very carefully about how we are going to manage and mitigate and adapt to what is a persistently warming situation. Now, why haven't we had a heat wave this year? Because as we see, the temperatures here are above the sort of the expected averages of what you'd expect to see. The reason it hasn't been extreme this year so far is that we haven't had the sort of stable weather conditions that have driven the heat wave in 2023. What happened in 2023 was that there was a large high pressure sat over the UK, which had a lot of stable weather. The stratification became very strong. The thermal heating of that stratification really intensified. So the interaction between a warming ocean and the general weather patterns will define just how severe the heat wave is. This year we've been lucky. The baseline has been high, but the weather conditions have not been such that the heat wave manifested. Next year, who knows? We might not be so lucky. So we talk about these environmental conditions, but what does that mean for the organisms that live in our coasts and oceans? So plankton, let's start with plankton. Base of the food chain, one of the most important elements of the marine system. And as you saw from the previous slides, we've been observing marine plankton at the Western Channel Observatory for many decades now. But equally, we're not just measuring one aspect of plankton. As we know, plankton's quite a generic term, but it ranges all the way from very microbial, pico-nanoplankton here that we take samples and run through the flow cytometer, phytoplankton, the autotrophs, all the way up to the zooplankton. So just measuring one of these parameters, we feel doesn't actually give us a really good insight into how the whole system works, because the connectivity between these different sort of aspects of marine plankton are critical. So what do I mean by that? If we look at all the plankton, we can and sort of measure how much plankton there is in each of the various size classes. We can look at the size spectrum. We can look at how biomass is distributed amongst the whole plankton community. And this tells us a lot about how healthy a marine community is. Energy starts here. Energy is fixed by these small elements of the plankton. Captured, sun's energy captured and turned into biomass. Now, effectively, that biomass is then used to fuel the rest of the food chain as that energy is passed on, ultimately ending up here in larval fish and up into fish. And in a healthy ecosystem, that sort of transition of energy is fairly efficient. So we have a relatively shallow slope on this line between sort of the biomass and the abundance of different parts of the system. So by measuring all aspects of the plankton, we get some kind of, as Matt says, an indicator of just how healthy this system's functioning. And as stress builds on a system, we see the efficiency of that energy transfer changing, and more energy being used up at the bottom of the food chain and less being able to come through to the higher trophy levels here. So this steepening of the graph gives us a warning sign that things are not happening. Well, things are happening at the system which we should be concerned about. And at the observatory, we've been able to look at different aspects of the plankton and actually see that happening in front of our very eyes. The changing slope of that, or the changing abundances of key elements of the plankton leads us to believe that the actual slope, the energy transfer is becoming less efficient. And interestingly, it's different at different times of the year. And the greatest periods of stress happen during the stratification in the summer, and largely due to nutrient limitation during the summer. So by looking at the whole plankton on a regular basis, what the observatory has allowed us to understand is not just that things are happening there, but gives us an insight into why that is happening. So we are moving from a simple, highly efficient energy transfer system from phytoplankton to zooplankton to fish to something that's far more complex with greater loss of energy, ultimately meaning that up here there's less energy available for the fish. And we are seeing the transition from this to this in our data. And this is not because these animals are more tolerant to higher temperatures than these animals and plants. It's actually linked into the warming stratification and nutrient stress. So it's not a direct effect so much of warming, but warming is creating greater stratification, greater nutrient stress, and thereby changing the community structure and function. Which is why it's so important that we measure so many different things, because sometimes the reason for things to happen aren't obvious. We might have assumed that this was just a temperature response, but it's not. It's more complicated than that. And by understanding the complexity of the response gives you a better opportunity then to put in mitigation or adaptation measures that are more appropriate. You can't fix things properly if the cause is misidentified. But as I said, integration is key in coastal areas, particularly in the shallow coastal shelf, where responses in the plankton community have huge impacts on marine benthic communities, whereby the provision of organic material to the benthos can be a huge driver of community structure and function in seabed communities. Which is why we added the benthic survey to our observations. We wanted to understand how the system as a whole was responding. So I would imagine, particularly around areas such as around Singapore, the interaction between benthic systems and pelagic systems is going to be critical. So why limit yourself to just observing one part of the system? And seasonal patterns of primary production in the water column and subsequent export of that organic material is going to be key in understanding how and why benthic communities are going to be responding. And for many blue economies, it's actually these benthic species that provide much of the resource in terms of fisheries, but also in terms of ecotourism as well. So this diagram here is a kind of a summary of some of the key components that we've been measuring at the WCO over many years. There's different time frames of data here. Starting back in 1988, where we started with the zooplankton and the addition of the phytoplankton. Then we bring other observations in online as and when we could. But by comparing these data here, we can see the seasonal cycles, we can see the phytoplankton blooms, very different in different years. In 2012, we decided that we wanted to do a deeper dive into the relationship between plankton communities, the organic material they provided, and the response to the seabed. What we weren't to know at the time when we started the study was that this would actually correspond to one of the largest phytoplankton blooms that we've seen at Western Channel Observatory ever, which was great news for us, but less good news for the two master's students who were doing all the sampling, because the spring bloom went on forever and they thought they were never going to get to the end of it. But it was a serendipitous but hugely valuable coincidence. So what did we actually see? Well, when we look, we instead of sampling sort of every month or so for benthos, which is what we've normally been doing as part of the benthic survey, we actually went out and sampled every month, every week, to coincide with the weekly sampling of plankton. So what we can actually see, what we documented through those samples, was the red line here indicates the kind of the progression of this plankton bloom throughout the year. This is day 0 all the way to day 270. We see the bloom, short little peak in the bloom, and then the big bloom picks up. Slight change in species here, largely a diatom-dominated bloom. But we can see here the abundance of the seafloor organisms also increased as the year went on, with then a little decrease at the end, and also to some extent the biomass. But one thing I'd also like to point out, which came as I suppose a little bit of a surprise to us, was the increase in the abundance of the macrofaunal community didn't come behind the spring bloom. It didn't wait for the spring bloom and then get triggered by it. It was already started to increase before the spring bloom came, which leads us to believe that actually the systems in place off Plymouth, the benthos is preconditioned to knowing that spring bloom is coming. So they are going to start to respond. So the cycles we see here imprinted in the benthic community and imprinted in the benthic community are there because of thousands, millions of years of knowing that spring blooms are coming. So if climate change starts to change the timing or intensity of these blooms, how well will these hardwired responses actually be able to adapt to changes in plankton blooms? We don't know. But I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about how these systems were coupled together. And we only get that insight because we take these observations together. But if you dive down more deeply, you can actually understand how different aspects of the marine benthic community are responding, comparing the deposit feeders, the suspension feeders, and the opportunists. And you can see that the big response here was largely from the deposit feeders. So the plankton bloom wasn't necessarily being filtered out by the fauna. It was waiting for the deposition of organic material, which in a system that's relatively shallow is probably not unsurprising, because deposition of organic material happens quite quickly at the Western Channel Observatory. So by differentiating how different parts of the marine community responded to that organic input, we were able to work with our ecosystem modelers to better refine how that model was structured and how benefit communities in that model were linked and sort of coded to respond to the organic matter input. So that's another important aspect of taking observations, is being able to better conceptualize how ecosystems work through ecosystem models, which then allow you to test scenarios and create projections of future conditions. So you can read more details about this particular study in this paper here. And this is what I basically said. So those are a few examples of how an observatory can give us insight into how systems work. And I think that's imperative. It's not enough to document what's happened. We have to understand why things are happening. But as you've seen over the years, the observatory has evolved, and it's continuing to evolve now. We live in an age now where AI, machine learning, autonomy is going to give us more opportunities to look more deeply into the marine system. Now, there are some that would argue that autonomy is a gateway to cheaper observatories. I think that's nonsense, okay? Autonomy does not make things cheaper. Autonomy does not make things, autonomy does not mean less people. Autonomy actually means that we can increase our knowledge, increase our ability to be in places at more times, increase our capacity to generate data. If anything, autonomy is going to increase the cost of observations and increase the number of people involved in those as well. But we shouldn't shy away from it, because it is really going to create a step change in our ability to lift the lid on how marine systems are working. One example of that we're adopting in Plymouth is EPICS, which is the Automated In Situ Plankton Imaging and Classification System. Another great acronym. Okay. Essentially, what we're doing is we're taking some, there's an imaging flow cytobot and a plankton imager plankton imager P10, which are devices that allow us to pass water continuously through these instruments, and they image every single plankton that goes through that instrument. So it documents the picture of every single plankton that moves through that flow cell. We are putting these instruments on the buoys at L4 to complement our regular weekly sampling. So effectively, we will be able to observe the plankton system from the smallest phytoplankton up to large zooplankton continuously. Underpinning this is a lot of work being done around the AI machine learning aspect, which allows computers to start doing the classification as well. The end goal being that we'll be able to complement the ongoing weekly observations, but also with regular data from the APIC system, which will radio in and tell us exactly what's happening, what plankton are there, how many there are, and what they're doing. This is where marine observatories are going, and we need to embrace that technology and that autonomy. Which is why in Plymouth, in partners with the Marine Biological Association and the University of Plymouth, we've set up the UK National Centre for Coastal Autonomy. Here you see a schematic of some of the marine observing platforms and assets that currently reside in Plymouth. But we couple together with industry partners as well around the Greater Southwest area who are building platforms like this, to try and pioneer and move forward and empower others to use autonomy in the observing of marine systems. So if this is an area you're interested in and want to gain capabilities in, we'd be really interested to partner up with you and share experiences on how autonomous platforms and technologies, including AI and machine learning, can really add power to our observations and understanding of marine systems. So in summary, so observing the ocean can start from very humble beginnings, from simple temperature measurements, taking a thermometer in a bucket taken every week at E1 in 1900. But essentially, there are three elements, I would say, to marine observations, and all of them are important. Firstly, high frequency, to allow us to understand ocean weather, track diurnal, tidal, seasonal cycles, and also identify those short, episodic, and increasingly extreme events. Long duration. Somebody once said to me, you should never start a marine time series because of the grief it's going to give you in terms of traveling for the family. I know someone told me that as well. But once you've started them, you should never stop them because their value will increase and increase and increase. The final thing is complexity. Try to bring as many different observations together as possible to understand the complex trade-offs, interactions, direct and indirect effects that are affecting the marine system. New technologies are emerging and will increase our capability and capacity to make those observations, but it's not a shortcut to cheap observations. It will lead, however, to a deeper understanding of how ecosystems work and how they're changing, and most importantly, what the cause of that change is. And where they exist, marine observatories should be cherished and protected as national, if not global, assets. But we need many more of them. So we need to build current observations into more robust, sustained observing platforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Widdicombe. Let's now move into the question and answer segment. I'll invite both Prof Ross and Prof Widdicombe up again to ask all your burning questions. For our in-person participants, please use the microphones located along the walkways. Should you have any questions for both Prof Ross and Prof Widdicombe?
Should I start off with just a general question? It's great. I think you're kind of preaching to the converted here. I think in Asia we're really trying to grow a lot of marine monitoring. Sorry, 1 second. I have a sore throat. Sorry. So I think we're really trying to build capacity on this a lot. And unlike a lot of technology, as technology improves and grows, things get cheaper, like our handphone, our mobile phones, everything gets cheaper. But unfortunately for this, it doesn't get cheaper. It doesn't get cheaper for us as well because I think the gap in the science is actually growing larger between a country like the UK and a country like Malaysia, where I'm from. So maybe you have some comments on that?
Yeah. I think when it comes to autonomy and technology, we often think, oh my God, look at that piece of kit, it's really expensive. So for example, the flow cytobot for measuring plankton, sold by McLean Labs for around $270,000, which sounds like a lot of money. But I would argue that that is not the expense of technology. It's the thousands of hours spent by the people making it work in terms of the technicians back in the laboratory, the plankton analysts who are going to be training the AI systems. In fact, the people who build the AI machine learning systems anyway. So I would actually say that the pieces of kit themselves, whilst initially they seem like a lot of money, the big expense of technology is in human time and resource. So we're going to, and that, we have to invest in that in the same way that you guys have to invest in that. So yes, I appreciate that buying the kit in the first place can seem daunting, but I would argue largely that once that investment is made, we're then back to the investment of people. Now, whether you're investing in people sitting at microscope, going through the samples for hours at end, picking through, you're still going to have to invest in people writing AI machine learning algorithms. And I would say, actually, the way to embrace technology is to upskill staff, upskill marine observing staff to think more about, you know, embracing the skills associated with AI and machine learning and and electronics, and it's about working with a new skill set of people. So I do appreciate initial outlay is hard sometimes for bits of kit, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it's always going to come down to people.
Can I just add to that as well? So I'm involved in writing a policy brief at the moment with a G7 Ocean group.
Is that working, John?
Oh, that's better. Yeah, policy. And one of the reasons we're writing this brief is there are a lot of governments around the world who look at some of the costs of these huge research vessels and monitoring systems, and they're questioning it. And what a classic is the Argo float system, with thousands of these floats. And one of the things that scientists have often not been great at is saying what is the ultimate societal benefit of these things, and what is the cost of not doing it? What is the cost of not understanding the system? And that's why I'm quite passionate about the policy side of things, because if people think, oh, we want to invest £1 million in a piece of kit because we're scientists and we like playing with kit, well, that's not really a great sell. But if you actually say, well, the risk of not understanding the system is we can't manage the system, and that has impacts on our fisheries, it has impacts on our societies and how we understand risk around flooding, then you start to get the message across to policymakers. Actually, it might cost millions, but what you're saving is potentially way, way more than that. So I think that's why the policy aspect is so important, because it's about the cost benefit. We're putting money into it, but actually we all know that the money you save down the line in understanding the system is way more than we will ever pay.
We're testing from online at the second just convened right now. So we're still testing in cost. The question is how much does running the observatory cost in terms of money and people?
Yeah, and if you spend the observatory costs around, in its very basic form, it costs around 600,000 UK pounds a year to run. But it's also supplemented by projects, sort of commissioned research funding, some in-kind support as well, and some of the overheads generated from our organisation. So I don't think you're probably going to get much change from every year. The investment will probably be about £1 million a year, which is a substantial amount of money. But that includes everyone. That includes staff time, and the vast majority of that is paying people to analyse the samples, go out and get the samples and generate the data. And storing the data, as I said, we spend a lot of time on quality controlling the data. So it is a substantial investment. It's getting harder and harder to fund it. UK funding, it's challenging. Sustained observatories just don't seem to be that sexy very often for a funder. So again, we need to make a much better sell on why we do that. But we as an organisation are so committed to that activity because we recognise the value, and we would urge and support and champion anyone who runs an observatory.
The gentleman at the back as well. Could you introduce your name as well as where you're from?
Good morning. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm from Widdicombe. Particularly on public awareness and public education. Right? So when you mentioned earlier with the data for policymakers, sometimes to end of the day of the policies, you have to look at the public's opinion. So is there any module or any way to call out, like you supply the data to the policymaker as well as using the same data to increase the awareness so that the public can agree to the policy at the end of the day?
Yeah. Do you want me to
You go first.
I'll go for it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. We've got a group at PML called Sea and Society. It's around social science, and it works a lot around understanding public perceptions. We have an environmental psychologist trying to understand motivations, because effectively, if you're going to change people's behaviours, you change their hearts and minds. Often evidence isn't enough to change society's views. It's something, well, it's often easier to change a politician's mind based on cold hard evidence than it is to change the public. For how many decades have we all known that smoking is bad for us, yet actually stopping people from smoking is more than an issue of just presenting evidence. So you are absolutely right. And I think understanding human perception, human behaviors, human interactions with marine systems is critical. And it's an area of research in its own right. And as part of the Western Channel Observatory, we have a social science element associated with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And ultimately, I mean, I sometimes when I give the talk I give, it gives the impression that that the whole policy area, they're just waiting for scientists and everything we say they're going to act upon, and that we know that's not true. I mean, fisheries is the classic one. We've been given really good, high quality fisheries information for years, and yet our fisheries all over the world are still in trouble because ultimately they're not just listening to what the scientists say. So I think educating the public is massive. Another really good example of this is in the UK, we have something we call the Blue Planet. What this meant was that we were talking about issues around, say, marine plastics for absolutely years. We had really good science around this. We knew there was a problem, but the policy people weren't really doing much. Then David Attenborough put Blue Planet on. He showed some fantastic footage of, you know, turtles and various other things and the problem the plastics cause. And immediately, of course, all the public see that. And because the public see it, they're then writing to their MPs and the policy people are on board. So I think there's always this two-pronged approach. And one of the things I would say that if you really want the policy people to move is get the NGOs on board as well, because the NGOs are really good at working with the public. And they can do things we're not allowed to. So, as an independent research organisation, we can't go out and lobby and, you know, wave flags and things like that because we're, as I said, that trusted science organisation. What we can do is give data and information to others, and NGOs, you know, your World Wildlife Funds and others are really good at going out and letting the public know what's happening. So yeah, I couldn't agree more that the public are a really important element of this.
Can I just add to that? Come to the next question. In the, um, I agree that sort of society-led calls to action are really important, and they are powerful, and they create change. But it's not doesn't always work like that. Remember, policymakers are people too. They are human beings. They also kind of want a beautiful ocean. They want to live on this planet. They do want to make good decisions. And and whilst the evidence we provide might not be sort of calling on people to take to the streets and rally for a better ocean. But what you can do is you can legitimize and smooth policymakers' decisions in certain areas because we're asking them to make decisions which can be quite disruptive to to individuals. It can come as cost, it can come as great sacrifice. But if we can lay some of the groundwork where we socialize these decisions so that the decision makers feel empowered to be able to make those without fear of being accosted by the electorate, then that's something as well. It's not all about rallying on the streets. It's also about preparing society to be accepting of sometimes very difficult decisions.
The one last question, which I think includes the online audience. The question is, who should base your data being in silos? Do you have any experience or insights in bringing data together with the wider scientific community?
Yes. Okay. There are. Oh my God, that's that.
Yes.
Right.
There is a lot.
Data share. I mean, data are the currency, and as scientists, it's very difficult for us to give up our data because we work so hard to get those data, and it's hard. You know, we spend money on getting it. To give it away seems difficult, but really, it's only through sharing. And also, there are some countries that have national legislation in place that actually stop data sharing. I mean, one example is if we think about the Sustainable Development Goal 14.3, which is about measurements of ocean acidity, all countries are mandated by the SDGs to submit pH data to the IOC UNESCO, yet many countries don't. And it's not because they don't have pH data, it's because they've made a national decision not to. I mean, India being an obvious example. India's approach to data is incredibly restrictive, I would say. From a national perspective, they see the data as being a national resource. Each country is in its own, it has its own right to decide on what it does. All I can say is try to advocate for greater sharing. The other thing is that people don't put their data in all the same places. There is not one global database. So something we're trying to do in conjunction with the IOC UNESCO is build more federated data systems where we take national data centers and large regional data centers and try to get them connected through there's a technology called AirDAP, whereby you can actually link these databases up. So wherever you put your data, it doesn't matter because behind the scenes, they'll all be linked up and then they'll be able to talk to each other and then you can pull the data out from wherever it is on the world. So we need to go down towards this federated data system.
People always see that you have for our question and like I think those random questions from the blog. See me once you try this shop from Widdicombe through a couple of things forward. So with that said, it comes down the end of the private talks for the day. I would like to take this opportunity to thank both the Professor and Widdicombe Institute for your morning with us the in-person or virtually. A workshop participants will be centered a series of talks from local and regional experts who will share their experiences on marine monitoring in their respective countries or regions. Before we begin with the next session, let's now take a short call rush. 15-minute coffee break. Please enjoy some light refreshments outside. And a reminder also, food and drink are not allowed in this camp. You may use the seminar room during the breaks. Please return for me for the next session, 11 a.m. Thank you, and we will see you then.